Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Sarah Abrevaya Stein, the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome so many friends and colleagues and students today to this talk by Professor Barbara Mann entitled The Object of Jewish Literature, a Material History. And I'm going to introduce the event with a couple of words before introducing my colleague and friend, Barbara. This event tonight is part of the Arnold Band Distinguished Lecture Series in Jewish Studies. We're so grateful to Milton and Sheila Hyman for their ongoing support of this series, along with other dear friends of Arnold Band and former students of Arnold Band and colleagues. We hope that you can join us at future events of the center, and there are some flyers in the back about our dynamic spring programming. Thanks to the Levy Center staff for all they've done for today's event, and I want to ask you just quickly to silence your phones before we get started. So it's really a pleasure to welcome someone who I know from my own start of career, as we were in tandem programs across the bay from one another, Berkeley and Stanford, and that is Professor Barbara Mann, the inaugural Stephen H. Hoffman Professor of Modern Hebrew Language and Literature at Case Western Reserve University. She has taught prior to her arrival at Case Western, at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, and she's the author of two wonderful books, as well as many other publications. A Place in History, Tel Aviv and the Creation of Jewish Urban Space, published by Stanford Press in 2006, and Space and Place in Jewish Cultures, published by Rutgers in 2012. These books explore themes having to do with identity and memory and space in Jewish culture. And her third book, which we are here to learn about and explore, is entitled The Object of Jewish Literature, a Material History, published in 2022 by Yale. And I do urge you to seek a copy from your local independent bookstore. It is a wonderful book on the history of modern Jewish writing that pays particular heed to material culture. And I understand that Barbara is now working on a study on the role of the book as an object in post-war Jewish cultures between global media and radical leftist politics. Let's see. Did I cover everything? Perhaps I covered everything. The most important thing to say is that Professor Mann is a dynamic scholar, a generous mentor, a beautiful writer, and an innovative explorer of the varied textual, spatial, and human dimensions of the modern Jewish, Hebrew, and literary canon. So we are delighted to welcome her today, and I introduce the talk to you, The Object of Jewish Literature, a Material History. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you so much. How's the sound? Excellent. So I want to thank the Levy Center, Chelsea White, Sarah, for this invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. I spent a lot of time in the archives. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this. With stuff that looks like this. Encountering the archival remains of 20th century Hebrew and Yiddish writing in libraries and collections in Jerusalem, New York, and Warsaw, I began to notice how fragile these little pieces of paper were. How fortunate that they survived, I thought, and how grateful I was to be able to handle them. Indeed, a lot of pre-war material turned out to be crumbling, even in the most careful of archival settings. So it was through work on a variety of writers and settings, writing about the emergence of Tel Aviv's urban center, or considering the cultural milieu of modern Yiddish poets in New York, that I increasingly became more sensitive to the idea of writing as a material endeavor, and the book as an object, a material possession that has traveled, circulated, and come under various types of physical stress as it has been traded and exchanged among different owners and readers. You're going to see a lot of these today. Now, this connection between Materiality and the book is in fact a long-standing feature of Jewish tradition, of Jewish cultures in many settings, deriving from the nexus between materiality, textuality, and the sacred. Certain kinds of religious texts, because they contain the written name of God, are believed to possess a kind of sacredness, and tradition demands that they be treated in special ways. There's a whole series of rituals that have developed around the handling of texts that are considered sacred, including their creation through scribal production, their use, handling them with a certain kind of respect, and even their disposal in the Geniza, a traditional archive or disposal space for certain kinds of Hebrew scrolls and books. What happened, I wondered, to this disposition toward the text as a special object within Jewish modernity, especially within those Eastern European settings that were the focus of my work, and given the great, though not absolute, shift to more secular habits of mind and body. Now, as a scholar of modern Hebrew literature, I'm aware of how writers refashioned traditional Hebraic texts. For example, the great Hebrew novelist and fabulist Shai Agnon. And here I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the scholar for whom this lecture series is named, Arnold, and his groundbreaking work on modern Hebrew literature. I first encountered his work when I was a Boston University undergraduate studying with Elie Wiesel, and we read Band's essential edited volume of the Tales of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, a collection that made possible a rare for the time literary readings of the writings of this important Hasidic figure. Band's insight that we could, and indeed perhaps should, read rabbinic and Hasidic writing for its allegorical meaning as literature, even as modernist literature, helped lay the critical foundations for the entire field of modern Jewish literary studies. And so I am truly honored to present my work here today on this particular occasion. So I knew how Agnon and his peers, such as Chaim Nachman Bialik and Leah Goldberg, and even later Israeli writers such as Yehuda Amichai, refashioned scripture. But what about the book itself? What happened, I wondered. As academics, as humanists, we get to wonder a lot, right? I wondered what happened to reverence for the text as a physical object in a more secular age. And so my book, The Object of Jewish Literature, is an attempt to trace the path of this transformation in which normative attitudes or dispositions toward the book as a sacred object informed the material features of modern Jewish art and writing. So it's in the visual arts, I think, that we get a more transparently, kind of a more transparent sense of the book as a material object. And so before getting into a discussion of literature and literary genres, I want to look briefly at a couple of paintings. Issachar Ber Ribak was a painter and sculptor from the Ukraine, back when we used to call it the Ukraine as opposed to Ukraine, who merged iconic Jewish forms with Jugendstil and Cubist motifs. So his still life with Aleph Beis, this painting here appeared, an image of it appeared, reproduction in the Warsaw little magazine Albatross in 1919. So traditionally associated with religious or secular texts, the Hebrew alphabet here is treated as a material object. The still life as a genre typically depicts the mundane items of everyday life. For example, the contents of a fruit bowl or a pantry, the remains of a meal. Placing the Aleph Beis or the Aleph Bet in such a generic setting both potentially strips the letters of their sacred meaning, but also, ironically, elevates them as a modernist object worthy of painterly attention. The painting offers one clue as to how reverence for the book, for textuality, in this case through the form of the Hebrew alphabet, might be transmuted and transformed in a modern secular idiom. So just to say here that what is germane and idiosyncratic for the Jewish painter is more generally found in the soup of modernist representation that deliberately blurred the boundaries between text and visual objects. So on your left here, can you see these images okay? Yeah, great. So, you know, on the left, Picasso and his kind of potpourri of things that look like objects and actually, you know, painting that is meant to resemble both fabric and wood. And then on the right, another still life by Ber Ribak, so working in that still life genre. And here he he juxtaposes sort of Jewish ritual objects, the etrog and a lulav, elements that are used in the harvest holiday of Sukkot, and also a text there in the background, again, in this sort of resolutely mundane genre. So these paintings bring me to what is a central question in my own work and in this book. What happens to reverence for the book as an object when Jewish cultures moved away from traditional Jewish forms and moved towards something we might call the secular? Where does devotion to the book as a material artifact go? Can we find residual traces of something called the sacred, even in secular genres such as the novel or lyric poetry? So in my book, I try to respond to this question by organizing a narrative of modern Jewish writing from the late 19th to the early 21st century around the idea of genre. And for the remainder of my presentation this afternoon, I want to focus on 3 different literary genres. In the book, there are 6 distinct chapters around genre. I'm happy to, talk a little bit more about that later. But for this afternoon, I've put together these images from these 3 different literary genres, 3 very distinct genres, I should add. So beyond their difference, one from the other, the little magazine, the Yizkor book, and the artist book, they are themselves not what is typically understood as genre or kind or style of literature, poetry, prose fiction, epic, etc. So those are more traditional notions of genre, but there's nothing natural or given at all about those genres. If the Industrial Revolution and capitalism produced the novel and globalization gave us postmodernism, then we must look to history to appreciate the genres endemic to any given age, and even specific to a particular cultural or social setting. Moreover, as certain generic forms are exhausted or reinvented, we can let go of the demand for generic purity, for something that is purely literature or purely the visual arts, and appreciate what the modernists knew. Great art is always already diverse, hybrid, speaking in multiple forms, and media. And it is, in fact, to my mind, in these mixed genres, I almost want to call that mongrel, that we find the residue of the sacred. So, our first genre of the afternoon, the Yiddish Little Magazine. The Little Magazine is a global phenomenon, published in many languages on several continents, typically from the late 19th century up until the Second World War. The period that I'm focusing on here is the interwar period. Its generic features are attuned to and shaped by what Yuri Slezkin called the Jewish century: migration, culture, and argument. They're published in places that hosted diverse emigre Jewish populations: Berlin, Warsaw, Kyiv, small cities, large cities, all cosmopolitan places that drew migrants from more rural or provincial settings. And so up on the right there, just a little bit of a quote. There are manifestos throughout these little magazines. I'll be quoting a little bit from some of them. The manifesto is kind of a piece of the architecture, right? Sort of a statement, a polemical statement about what art should or should not be. And this is from Albatross, the Berlin Little Magazine, 1922, and he's describing the genre of the Little Magazine. What is the form? Why are they publishing it? What is the Little Magazine meant to be? It's meant to serve as a bridge, 4 walls, and a beam for the lone homeless poets in their wandering through strange lands to the different centers of the Jewish people's extraterritoriality. So in this excerpt, Greenberg, who himself was a central literary and cultural influencer during this period, he imagines the Little Magazine as an architectural structure, a temporary domicile to shelter Jewish writers and artists in their precarity as they move from place to place. Indeed, these journals were produced collaboratively by groups of writers, loose cohorts that Raymond Williams called formations. These were diverse groups of immigrants from more provincial, less economically advantaged settings who were drawn to cities for socioeconomic reasons and ended up involved in provocative, even dissident cultural projects, including the Little Magazine. So the term little refers here, I think, to their relatively limited edition size, typically 1,500, a couple of thousand, and therefore their circulation. These were not meant to be mass market media, and even though we may today marvel over their resilient existence in archival settings, they do not feel as if they were produced to last longer than the hands of the last link in a limited chain of readers. These magazines featured essays on contemporary politics and social issues, as well as poetry, book reviews, reviews of art exhibits, in other words, a broadly erudite magazine of culture. However, the little magazines also have a strong relationship to Jewish tradition. For example, witness the sustained use of Hebrew letters as decorative ornaments and features of visual design. You can get a sense here, again, in the sort of the geographic spread, New York, the Middle East, Europe. I would go so far as to say, again, in relationship to the Hebrew letters as a part of the design, I would go so far as to argue, and I do this more at length in my book, that modern Jewish artists and writers brought a sensitivity to the alphabet as such, to the letter as a material icon to their work, and this condition informed a more general modernist treatment of text as image or object. The example of the Little magazine offers some of the clearest evidence that, as recent scholarship has also demonstrated, the categories of the religious and the secular are in fact more dialectically connected than absolutely in conflict. And indeed, these journals contain religious forms reworked and repurposed in radical and even playful ways as new forms of literary and cultural expression. So how exactly does this work? Here is one extended example. So I'm going to show you a few slides now with images related to a 1919 ethnographic tour of wooden synagogues in the Ukraine. This is conducted by Ber Ribak, the artist from a few slides ago, and his friend and collaborator, Eliezer Lizitsky, aka Elizitsky, himself a young illustrator of Yiddish children's books, who would eventually become one of the most influential figures in early 20th century typography and design. The pair traveled around their native Ukraine, sketching and drawing inspiration from the ceiling murals found in these synagogues. Murals filled with Art Nouveau style images of animals and the zodiac. Lizitsky himself reflected upon the experience in a short essay for another Berlin little magazine, Milgräum Rimon, published jointly in Yiddish and Hebrew. More on that in a minute. So this is Lizitsky's recollection of his encounter with these synagogues and what they meant to him artistically. Every synagogue has a small library. The cases hold some of the oldest editions of the Talmud and other religious texts, each with front pieces, decorative devices, and tail pieces. This paratexts, right? He's not really interested in the Talmud for its contents. He's interested in them as objects and for their visual ornamentation, their decorations. These few pages fulfilled the same function in their time as illustrated journals do in our own day. They familiarized everyone with the art trends of the period. So I'm not, Lizitsky was not an art historian. I'm pointing here to his, the source of his inspiration. And this is an example of what he might have seen. This is just a couple of examples of this sort of elaborate front pieces before you get to the Talmudic text itself. So again, the pair, Lizitsky and Ber Ribak, they're not interested in the Talmud for its religious or halachic content, but for its size, its presence, its physical presence, its visual design, its paratextual elements. But the ceiling murals were the real show, and they were really the place, I think, where we can see this kind of inspiration of a certain sort of visual language. There's, on the right, you'll see photographs of the ceilings, and then on the left, these are sketches from their journals where they're copying certain figures from the zodiac. This is the Mohilev synagogue, the zodiac. And, here we go. Here's Ber Ribak's cover, directly inspired by those synagogue murals. On the left, Egan's from Kiev, 1920, and also the table of contents there on the right for the same journal, the animals, the script. These are some of my favorite images ever, I think, so much so Ivo gave me permission to put not just the cover, but the entire journal on the cover of my book. So another additional repurposing of these synagogue motifs. These are two different covers by Marc Chagall, who was also a part of this itinerant group of writers and artists involved, Zugesan, in producing these journals. On the left, you have Sturm, or Stream, published in Moscow in 1922, Haliastra, The Gang, published in Warsaw in 1924. So with their use of these Hebrew letters, the journals were both internally coded for Jewish readers, but also spoke the avant-garde language of international modernism. Just a couple more examples here of Hebrew, again, center stage in this expressionist multilingual cover of a journal called Albatross. The title of the journal comes from the poem by Baudelaire, which is a kind of romantic lyric, and it's reworked by the Yiddish poet Esther Shumiacher in one of these journals. And there, the Yiddish poets they're not really very graceful birds, right? The albatross has these kind of heavy heads. And so there's kind of poking fun a little bit at the ethereal image of the poet in the Baudelairean model to say, well, Yiddish poets we have our feet on the ground there. So this is a journal that's published first in Warsaw and later in Berlin. And you see here's the table of contents from the 1922 edition, first in Warsaw. And just look on the right there and notice that kind of geometric shape, hearkening back for me, and this is, I don't know, it's a little much, right? But I just couldn't resist. When I was putting together the images for this afternoon, I wanna ask, the distinction that we make sometimes between stylistic periods, seems to me that artists really borrow quite freely. And it is, it's not too, I don't think it's too far-fetched to think that the sort of the freeness of something we find in some of these Talmudic front pieces made their way into, again, this kind of exuberant playfulness with the letters that we see in these Yiddish little magazines. So one final example from what is really kind of the apex of this interwar period of Yiddish little magazines, Jewish little magazines. This is the Berlin journal, Milgräum Rimon, Pomegranate, a product of high Weimar culture, we might call it, elegantly designed, really a very high-end production in both Hebrew and in Yiddish. If you are able to get to an archive and handle one of these things, it's pretty marvelous, and they have stood the test of time, very high-quality production, high-quality paper. The pomegranate, of course, an honored and privileged fruit in biblical tradition. It appears on Aaron's priestly robes, the description of Aaron's priestly robes, a symbol in many cultures of fertility, but within Jewish culture, it's linked with artistic expression, and especially to art for ritual purposes. So notice here, I don't have one of those little thingies, so you'll just have to, right? The letters. These are designed by a woman named Francesca Baruch. I'm going to show you her picture in just a minute. It's really one of the most important Hebrew typographers of the 20th century. She begins in Berlin, and for the design here, which she put together with Rachel Wischnitzer, the art historian and critic who was part of the power duo behind the production of this journal, the design of the letters was inspired by the Prague Haggadah. And you can see, that this font, right, her work on these Yiddish little magazines informs the creation of Baruch Shokin, which becomes a central Hebrew font of the 20th century. Hebrew in the public sphere, like I think sometimes now we think it's normative and take it for granted, but somebody actually invented that type that we see, and here it is in the masthead of Haaretz. So on the left, some letterpress type from the studio at Case Western Reserve. In the middle, a New Year's greeting that I printed with this Baruch Shokin font. And then on the right, an example. You can see that pretty clearly there. Kind of, if somebody knows what those little circles are called, I'd be very happy. I just keep calling them the little circular doodads. I don't think that's the technical term. But, again, we can, these magazines were kind of their day, very much a part, again, of this international modernism, but we can see a little bit of the ways in which those innovations have carried down to our own day. Okay, now to shift gears for a moment. Here we are at our second genre. The writing, compilation, and publication of memorial books emerged during and after the Second World War. And as a genre, they resemble in some ways those pre-modern Judaic forms of written memory, such as the Pinkas, books or pamphlets that commemorated the names of victims of anti-Semitic violence. But the size, quantity, and distinctive form of the Yiskerbücher, as they are known in Yiddish, make them a genre unto themselves, embedded in the conditions of their time. The people who wrote and compiled these books created a post-war genre that directly engaged the question of materiality. In their prefaces and introductions, editors described the books as tombstones or memorial candles. They were understood first and foremost as objects, specifically objects that would perform the work of memory. In such, the memorial book, or the Yiskerbuch, is most definitively a product of its age, a time of physical dispossession and destruction. In comparison to the mobile ephemerality of the little magazine, the Yiskerbuch emerges as a genre of enduring presence within an enormous arena of absence. Between 900 and 1,500 of these volumes were published during the waning years of the war and in DP camps, later into the 1970s, in the towns and cities of Jewish migration, each devoted to the history and experiences of a particular town. They were typically published by a group of survivors, so the collaborative nature of the Yiskerbuch is very similar, I think, to the collaborative work of the Little magazine. But these survivors wrote large portions themselves or solicited material from their fellow townspeople, stories, photographs. The books honored the memory of the dead. They tell the history of their town on behalf of their surviving community and their descendants. And while many of these towns were places that still physically existed, as spaces they existed only in memory. One thing people immediately notice about the Yizkor books is their size. These are big books, both in terms of their physical dimension and in their length. The longest I've seen is over 1,000 pages, but it's not unusual for them to be 500 or 600 pages in length. Needless to say, they didn't really edit anything out. You didn't get rejected if you submitted something to a Yizkor book. They were written largely in Yiddish, later in Hebrew and English, following some of the languages of Jewish dispersion after the war. They've been used somewhat skeptically by historians interested in accounts of the war, often perceived as unreliable, too personal, based on a kind of subjective experience rather than the hard evidence of data and artifact. This view, I think, has begun to shift in recent years, and scholars are now more interested in assessing the unique contributions made by these complex and often confounding volumes. Yizkor books have a shared iconography, for example, different kinds of candles and flames, candelabras, chanukiot, referencing the memorial practice of lighting a candle for a dead family member or a loved one. Tombstones and books are also featured throughout in their illustrations, especially referencing the names and families of fellow landsmen or townspeople. This is an image that I found in two different Yizkor books, both published in Tel Aviv in the 1950s. They shared an editor. The image of a bombed-out, crumbling building in Warsaw, weeping in mourning and wearing a prayer shawl and tefillin, or phylacteries, is by the Polish painter and artist Bronislaw Bońke. His painting, which is called El Mole Rachamim, God full of mercy, is a reference to the traditional Jewish prayer of mourning. So, a non-Jewish Polish painter used this expressly Jewish iconography to mourn the destruction of Warsaw. The painting is part of Bońke's series, a post-war series about Polish resistance, but it gets repurposed by Jewish survivors in Tel Aviv as a symbol of their own town's destruction. And this kind of sharing and circulation of the Yizkor book as a generic form was also evident to me several years ago in Warsaw, when I encountered Polish translations of these books, produced by young Poles who were interested in urban microhistories, narratives of their towns that had been erased during the Soviet era. Many of these books also have, this is from his series in which that painting is included. Many of these books also have maps, town maps, typically hand-drawn by a survivor, including central landmarks or sites in the town, connected to Jewish life, but also sometimes personal sites. Some of them have this kind of cartographic feel. They look almost professionally drawn. Others appear to be hand-drawn on the back of a napkin. So this is one of my favorite you'll see in the top right there, the group of trees is marked as Jenteswald, the forest where the gossips gathered. Apparently this space was meaningful enough for the mapmaker to include. Other sites include the demarcation of the ghetto, as well as public spaces in different buildings related to religious worship. One might ask, is this more a map or a picture with the sort of the distinctive barbed wire that appears there? And here, a kind of a legend referencing individual homes, including that of the mapmaker. This is kind of a rare example where we actually have the name of the mapmaker. And typically we think of maps as instruments of power. These maps in the Isker books are very much maps of resistance and maps of memory. I'm happy to come back to any of these slides when I'm done. One last genre. A final set of images connected to this third genre, one located firmly in the post-war period. I want to touch just briefly here before I conclude on the example of the artist book as a way of continuing to consider how, again, this residue of the sacred continues to inform secular genres of cultural expression. The idea of the artist book dates back to the modernist work of French artists such as Mallarmé, but it is in the post-war period, and especially beginning in the 1970s, alongside pop art and other object-oriented postmodernist trends, that the artist book comes into its own as a distinctive genre. And that being said, the artist book represents a relatively loose category encompassing many different styles and types of books. So for example, there are what we might call kind of one-offs, entirely singular or very limited editions, things we might think of encountering in a private or archival collection as part of a museum exhibit. These are items that often represent many hours of labor and are made from rare or carefully curated materials. So this is one example. It's an edition of 50. Tatjana Kellner made one of her father's arm and the other of her mother's arm. So it's a pair, a book that comes in twos, 50 copies of each. And the plaster Paris arm with her father's concentration camp number on it appears in the book as a kind of a marker, and then around it there are pages with different kinds of translucents and text that tell the story of her father's experience during and after the war. 50 years of silence. So those are, that's sort of one end of the spectrum. But at the other end, right, artist books can also be cheaply produced for mass distribution, what the scholar and artist Joanna Drucker has called democratic multiples. So for example, zines, a subgenre of artist books which can be very quickly composed even from a single sheet of paper. It's a kind of mini comic juxtaposing text and image to tell a story or make a philosophical or political argument. Artist books as a genre, therefore, offer different modalities of cultural capital. They can be unique, even elitist, but also mass-produced and widely distributed. In all cases, however, and this is my own kind of thumbnail definition, an artist book is any book that itself interrogates the notion of what it means to be a book. And this interrogation occurs most especially on the level of form. That is, artist books typically play with the normative features of the codex, the spine, paper pages, front and back covers. Indeed, artist books might open in different ways, dispense altogether with pages, and use non-standard materials, cloth, stone. I've even seen human hair. Some artist books harken back to traditional forms like scrolls. Others have the play and the exuberance of the little magazine. Now, given the central role of the book as both artifact and symbol within Jewish culture, it might not come as a surprise to find a preponderance of Jewish artists working in this genre. Women artists in particular have used it as a forum for engaging and critiquing normative patriarchal limits placed on women's learning in some traditional settings. Andy Arnowitz's multilingual artist book produced in the Jerusalem print workshop, and then part of her series is kind of reclamation of early modernist Hebrew writers. And finally, me. I want to close with a couple of examples from my own work. This is an artist book that I created a few years ago in a workshop in Salt Lake City. It's kind of an opportunity to put into practice some of the more theoretical ideas that I have about the book as an object. It's a meditation on the book as a thing, playing on the Hebrew word dvarim, which means both words and things, and it's also the Hebrew name, the Hebrew title of the biblical book of Deuteronomy. So you can see on the outside, the cover there, a little bit of an homage, I think, to Albatross, to the covers of some of those Yiddish little magazines, but I used, for the Hebrew dvarim, I used a kind of a gold lettering to mimic like a precious folio or codex. And then it opens. It's a book containing a collection of objects, following Adrian Piper's maxim that books are things that hold things. Inside I've included miniature facsimiles of the cover of the Yiddish little magazine Schriften, published in New York City in 1919, a copy of an essay by the Russian-American Jewish painter Max Weber, the other Max Weber, called Sachen, or Things, published in Schriften, and I had located a handwritten draft by Weber in the Smithsonian Archives. There's a copy of that in there as well. A piece of wood and a scroll and a piece of wood, a nod to pre-modern written forms and to the environs of Salt Lake City. So what began as an inquiry into locating the sacred in historical documents encountered in archives has led to a rededication to materiality in my own scholarship and teaching. In this, I participate in a broader trend called bibliographical, or just biblio-makers, a movement predicated upon the idea that certain kinds of knowledge are best gained through personal experience and experimentation. I don't necessarily imagine a future archival home for my prints and artist books, although I have had at least one curator sort of say to me, what are you going to do with all that stuff? So who knows? But I believe that creating them has allowed me to experience more intimately some of the material conditions in which modern Jewish literature was produced. Thank you.
Wonderful. We are going to open up this space for questions, and it's my pleasure perhaps to start with one messy question, if you're willing, something that I think that you explicate in a little more detail in your wonderful book, but perhaps was less foregrounded here. So here is an intentionally meandering question. I was thinking, listening to your wonderful presentation about Marina Rustow's work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and her interest in thinking not so much about text, but object in that context, and the things written on reverse sides and so forth. And I wanted to ask you, to speak for a little bit about what is the theoretical or even emotional precondition for moving from thinking about text as text to thinking about text as object. And I thought to ask this in part because of your beautiful homage to Arnie Band in the introduction, and thinking about the transition of the field of the study of Hebrew literature and also Yiddish literature, and its ebbs and flows, and how perhaps this project grows out of a transition moment in thinking, in training, in orientation.
Man, that's a big question, Sarah. I mean, I think I'm going to speak about it really personally because I don't, to sort of think about my own intellectual trajectory in relationship to the field, that's a kind of an interesting question, but I think because we've known each other in this way for a while, that you see it. So I began with the text, and that was my interest and that was my training, and as a comparatist and as a student of comparative literature at Berkeley in the 1990s, specifically of Hebrew and Yiddish, it was all about the text. In other words, we were interested in textual analysis and in a kind of elevating Hebrew and Yiddish as languages that were worthy of being included in the comparative literary project. And so my own mentors, Robert Alter and Chana Kronfeld, were really instrumental in sort of in centering Hebrew and Yiddish, right, in a post-colonial theoretical moment when Yiddish was understood to be on the periphery. And they wanted, I don't know if they would have said it in this way, but I think in their example as mentors and as scholars, they centered Hebrew and Yiddish and textual study in a way that was a model and sort of an inspiration for for me and for my peers, not for my colleagues. So that was then. And then I think at some point when I was interested in, when I understood that I really wanted to write about Tel Aviv, I realized that I needed to go beyond the text. And so that for me was one shift to the spatial turn, which I don't think was, maybe I should backtrack, right? So the elevation of the text at Berkeley also had to do with new historicism. There's somebody from the English department who was there at the same time that I was, right? And so that kind of historical, the devotion to the historical anecdote as something that could be also kind of elevated in a certain way and paradigmatic as the paradigm as opposed to something more comprehensive. And then the spatial turn, I think, and again, this sort of, in Berkeley, thinking everything is a text, even spaces, to then reading spaces as text. That shift in my own work, which resulted in my first monograph on the history of Tel Aviv, or the history of the cultural depiction of Tel Aviv, I think that there was a shift within Jewish studies as a whole, and I was part of that shift. And now there's another shift. And, and for me, it's kind of the obvious place to go, and it's just intellectually. How do I get there then from space to object? And we see now materiality appearing as a kind of a key word in many disciplines, and appearing very differently, I should say, right? So there's the biography of the object, Marxist turn. There's the apodorai turn in the social sciences. And, and I think I'm attentive to, and I have been shaped and influenced by these ways of thinking about materiality, but I'm also just interested in what I'm interested in. Do you know what I'm saying? And so those, and
that's wonderful. Thank you.
That's just where it is.
Right.
And without, and if it happens to engage, and I think it does, when I now, so next week I'm going to be at this conference in Minneapolis on the history of Hebrew type. And it's, so it seems like there's a kind of a moment now where we're thinking back to the basics, book history, book studies, all of that.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. And just to follow up, it's interesting to me that perhaps this runs in tandem with a different inclination to think about the intersection of secular and sacred. I mean, it strikes me that your teachers had, if you'll forgive the expression, almost a religious zealotry about an elevation of secular.
Yeah.
But now,
Dafka, we would call it. Yes, for sure.
But now you have moved us into a new direction, which is to say, and you find peers here, but to really think about the porousness in Yiddish and Hebrew culture of secular and sacred tropes and styles.
For sure. I mean, I think I intuitively always was troubled by that, this idea that they were on different sides of the table or different sides of the fence, that wasn't, it didn't seem to me analytically or even descriptively sufficient to what actually happened within Jewish experience or within Jewish writing. And so when I think about, Charles Taylor's work, or, that there's ways in which that big architecture of the secular, particularly in Judaism and Christianity, Islam is another story, I think, a related but a different story. It feels to me that these modern secular genres really emblematize that. I like that term, the porousness. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I see there are some hands. Erin.
I wonder if you could say more about textual materiality in relationship to sort of the scarcity or particularity of sacred texts versus archive, that, sort of, this is the world that's disappearing, we need the archive of it in its particularity in relationship finally to the modernism where we express the kind of uniqueness of our artistic impulse by way of the scarcity of text. Like when you're doing this in a different, and when the relationship to mass publication at the same time.
Oh, man. These books that I'm not entirely sure that I understand the question, I have to confess, but I'm going to try and address it. Do you want to rephrase?
Well,
Do you-
there seemed to be, you were talking about sort of how the secular, sort of sacred text, where it is very much about
Scarcity,
the particular,
yes.
the materiality.
Yes.
And then you also have archival impulse, where
I know where you're
you keep
going.
the record
I
of
think we need
this-
Walter Benjamin here. I think. I mean, it seems to me I think that's sort of behind your question, for me at least, right? Sort of the aura, right? But what happens to art in the age of mechanical reproduction? Like, where does that aura go? And
in the textual specific, yes.
So, in my book, I use the term affordances to describe what I understand to be the ways in which genre can offer us ideas about materiality, so that every genre has its own specific set of material affordances. This is a term from architecture where, like in a particular climate or a particular, like the covering of a building is either steel or a particular kind of glass to accommodate the climate or the specific use of the building, right? So what would an affordance look like in genre? So for example, in poetry, where you have, in lyric poetry in particular, where you have this kind of focus on language, very specific language, the right words in the right order, the best words in the best order. I think that was Gwendolyn Brooks, who was not a modernist, but she knew what she was talking about as a poet. So this focus on language per se, I try to sort of unpack that in material terms. What does that get us, right? Poetry being a normatively narrative art, an art that happens over time. It's an art of temporality. But if you have either diction or syntax, or in the case of Hebrew and Yiddish, actual, verb forms, because Hebrew and Yiddish have that ability to form entire sentences by just glomming on prefixes and suffixes. So there's a kind of a density to the language which approximates what poetry could do if it was going to be a material form. And of course you have the whole domain of imagism, which is a transnational poetic trend that really sought to mimic sculpture in some fashion, or to be like paint, right? This was sort of this was their desire as poets. Or picture poems, for example, would be another way. So, I mean, I don't know if that's addressing exactly, but that's where I'm going to go with that.
Thank you.
Or, yeah.
David.
So your talk evoked three fragments for me. The first is the Stein and then Heine reference to the text as homeland. The second is the historian of Hebrew literature, Knoxman's reference to the journal as the University of the Jewish people.
Nice.
And the third is the concept of Yiddish thought. And my question is, in light of those three references, what do your protagonists demarcate for us? In other words, do the books as an aggregate mark out for us something other than a genre, something that reflects a collective expression? It certainly seems to speak a certain degree of extraterritoriality, and your text, to borrow Sluskin's phrase,
Yeah.
paradigmatic mercurial. It's precisely the movement
Sure.
of mobility that's so interesting. And that helps us. Is it a republic of letters that we're talking about?
Yeah.
And I guess this relates to the point about materiality. Is it, by definition, disembodied of its readers and authors?
David. I think I don't want it to be disembodied. Let's put it that way. My desire is to house these antagonists somewhere. And the antagonists, by the protagonists, I mean the books themselves. I'm thinking of a volume that I recently wrote about from YIVO. They're having an online exhibit and a big celebration, 100 years, 100 objects. And so they sent me a few volumes to write about. And one of them was from Vilna, recovered from Vilna after the war, and it's a volume of book plates. So it's like 400 pages. Somebody sewed them together, and they're just book plates. And each book plate is like a world, really, because you can see the sort of the personal dedication. There's some, sometimes there's a little bit of a picture, and they're of course in different languages. So, that to me, where are those books? Those are the books without their owners. Those are their books without without their libraries, without their homes. Their home libraries for the most part. Even the home libraries are institutional libraries. So that, to me, that is the emblem of the Jewish reader in the 20th century. Those book plates, but gathered. So they're not just kind of out there. I think in this completely dispersed, disembodied way, some institution, or in this case, some individual in Vilna, decided to sew them together or to put them into a book together to house them. And then that volume made its way. Lucy Davidovich probably brought it, to New York, and then Steph Halpern in the YIVO archive sent it to me to write about. But she didn't send it to me physically. They just sent me a copy. But I can go and visit it in New York. So I think that there is a way in which there's something that is, yes, disembodied, that is far-flung. Greenberg, who wrote that, what I read about the disembodied, the poets and their wandering in the little magazine as a sukkah, he begins as a Yiddishist. And he publishes this poem, a Yiddish poem, Uri Tzvi Fahren Tzelem, Uri Tzvi on the cross, in the shape of a cross. He gets, kicked out of Poland, makes his way to Berlin, and eventually goes to Palestine and, moves all the way to the right as a Hebrew poet. So that's another trajectory, and that's another kind of, non-disembodied. That's another kind of embodiment. I think that what I'm talking about is a different kind of embodiment. It's at least a different variety of materiality. But there doesn't only have to be one.
Thank you. I'm going to slowly make my way around the room.
Maybe
Naomi.
call on a couple of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So maybe we'll call on Naomi and then Benjamin, and then we'll come back to Bob.
I wanted to ask about two things that I'm not sure are related, to be honest. The first was the difference between the text that your presentation focused on and the text in your sort of like title card image. So like the image that was on the screen while we were all schmoozing was of these little scraps of paper that are handwritten.
Yeah.
And probably got stuck between the pages of someone's notebook, or they're at the bottom of a box, yada, yada. And then your presentation focused on these books that are so like craft-driven, they're meant to endure, like people have taken so much care over them, they're like supposed to be reliquaries of something that they are recognizing as significant, that are supposed to be carried over into the future, as opposed to these little notes that probably only still exist because someone forgot to throw them away. So I was interested in how those two sort of types of materiality sort of co-construct Jewish textuality or like Jewish modernity in some strange way. But then the other thing I wanted to ask about is not Jewish or modern, which is the mixture of the playfulness and religiosity seems to be looking back towards the tradition of monastic illumination. And I was wondering if maybe that's what you were talking about when you said like the shared tradition between Judaism and Christianity. So now that I say it out loud, they're not related questions. So I have two questions.
They're great questions, Seth, but
Do I
ask
answer
Ben.
that?
Do I want to answer? Just get one more,
Okay,
just for the
Benjamin.
sake of.
Sure. Thank you. I was thinking about to add to the discussion about embodiment. Another approach to this sort of idea of the residue of the sacred is something very bodily, and it's like a bodily encounter, both with the letter as form, but also the book. And I was thinking about how that the bodily encounter with the book is something that Weber certainly paints over and over, and it was in the Reebok painting that you showed. So I was sort of, thinking about wondering if you can speak to where sort of the body is in the residue of the sacred.
Man, those are great questions. The illuminated manuscripts, I think, are kind of they're a precursor, I think, to the work a lot of the work in the little magazines, and also even to a much later genre that I'm interested in, which is the graphic novel, right? That there's this kind of, it's not just like structurally what we see, right? So we have J.T. Waldman, who gives us The Scroll of Esther as a graphic novel and draws explicitly on a kind of a history of Persian art, of Jewish art, in the sort of the manner of the illuminated manuscript, but not only. So I think for sure that the playfulness is there from that pre-modern genre as well. And the Scroll of Esther, I think, is like a kind of a paradigmatic location for that. So your first, that was really beautiful. I love that question about the relation between the scraps and the bound items. I don't know. I don't really know how to figure that more beautifully than you did. I think that the notion of like sort of the found, and in some of the like my current fascination is with books that were produced in concentration camps. Mm-hmm. Like, how did that happen? And how do we have them? So this is it's a kind of a severe backstory. It's like the provenance of where they came from. We just rely on the person who donated it to the archive, and they said, Sender gave it to me in the camp when I helped him with his tuberculosis. I don't know, so that's the sort of the notion of the found, as opposed to something that you're right, and this connects to the mass media question earlier, right? These were those little magazines especially, and even the Isker books as well, which were also printed in relatively limited editions, but now live on thanks to the Yiddish Book Center and the New York Public Library. You can find them online, but in this homogenized, digital, disembodied setting. But so that the found object, those scraps, and I think they're very much set in opposition to these other kind of crafted things. I appreciated that distinction so much. Thank you.
And Benjamin's question about embodiment.
Oh my God. Mm-hmm. I think that when you can see, this is, something that is sometimes lost when the great virtue of these digital collections is that we have them, and we can access them, and they can circulate and we can use them, but we lose, I think, the marks of people's fingers, the penciled annotations, in relation to these books that were created in the camps. They're typically quite small because they needed to be hidden. And you can imagine all of the places in which the books were hidden. So the question of the body there is really essential.
Thank you. Bob.
Two questions, one that this brought up, and that is really what's going to happen now that stuff is being published essentially for Kindles. Okay? It may never exist on paper. And the second one, which is sort of purely secular, which was driven by your image up there, is as I walk down the street in any modern international city, I see the language in a myriad of really weird forms because of advertising font design.
Sure.
How does that affect what's happening? I've seen it, I know it's in Tel Aviv because I've seen it there. And how does that affect the whole language structure when you start seeing these marketing fonts which have no historical background?
So, so some of them actually do have a historical background. I think it's just a matter of kind of peeling, apropos the Hebrew fonts in the public sphere. They actually do have a historical background. It's just, we just kind of don't notice it anymore because, again, there's so much of it, and maybe we're a little bit, it feels a little kind of normalized in certain ways. But there are two kind of really interesting innovations in Hebrew type design that I'm aware of in recent years that I would share. One has to do with the grammatical gender of Hebrew, and let me see if I say this correctly, because I didn't practice this. But typically, if you're addressing in the public sphere, if you see like an instruction for the public, it would be in the Hebrew masculine plural. And now you can see in signs in many places, in schools, where there's a new way of ending the word that kind of accommodates the feminine plural as well. And you see this, excuse me? I'm just saying, you asked specifically about Hebrew, so I'm saying, and in Hebrew it's like kind of, it's just, if you're not used to it, you're not used to it. But I'm imagining that kids now who go to schools where they see these signs that are meant to be not so much gender neutral, maybe gender inclusive is a better term for these particular signs in Hebrew, that their eye will kind of get used to it. The other is a new type that was created by a young Israeli font designer that combines Hebrew and Arabic. And so the top of the letter is in Hebrew and the bottom is in Arabic. It really is kind of mind-blowing and beautiful. I remember your first question. Oh, the Kindle. I just think the death of the book is like exaggerated. I don't really believe it. I'm just gonna say. No, I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it because I have a Gen Z kid and she loves books. And she also loves her Kindle, but bookstores are thriving. I don't think we need to, I think there are other things to worry about.
Please don't.
So I'm going to follow up on a couple of questions. Let me organize myself. I find it interesting that maybe it's one of the categories. Haggadah has always attracted me as a place where material culture and current material culture finds a home. And maybe it's because sometime in Amsterdam there was walked around and saw these wonderful Haggadahs that I had. And then there are children Haggadahs, and then there's avant-garde ones. So if you could comment about that. And then there's material culture that's Hebrew in sculptures in the Beverly Hills Gardens.
Oh, wow.
And their names and then letters and so that's material culture. And then I thought, we publish all the time in synagogues annual Yisro books, but we don't have the art. It's the art that pops off the page and that brings us to looking at it, which brings me back to Haggadah. I'm looking forward to seeing the different Haggadahs that are all stacked up in boxes and put away for a year in order to make sure you're interested again.
I mean, I think the Haggadah is, after the Scroll of Esther, is probably, the place where it's a kind of the pre-modern location of a lot of this creativity. And it's also, to be fair, kind of a particular feature, I think, of American Jewish culture. The sort of the endless, but it comes from somewhere. And, whether it's, the images are included to kind of help keep people awake, or, there are a lot of theories as to why and how, but it is, I think it's unique, is what I would say, in its kind of narrative, in its formal, in its structure, right? And sort of, it is kind of a hybrid volume. I don't even know what to call it, because it's meant to be performed, but then it also has, the sort of what I would call the paratextual elements, which is like the Yiddish song that everybody sings, or the Aramaic thing, or the, so it is this kind of accumulative kind of text. Yeah.
By the way, I remember from playing last week, it's in Pasadena Players, the focus was on Latinx. I'll get it wrong, so please excuse me, but the actress said at one point, there are 99 women in the room and they're all Latinas. One man walks in. They're no longer Latinas, they're Latinos. And that's the comment you were making.
Yeah,
Professor Mann.
for sure.
Thank you for your presentation.
My pleasure.
All right.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Barbara,
Thank you,
for a
Sarah.
wonderful book and presentation, and thank you all for your wonderful questions and
Thank you.
presence.